Welcome to Outdrive, folks. I'm your host, Cliff Callis, and each week I'm bringing you actionable marketing insights you can apply to reach, connect with, and convert rural American consumers. Outdrive is powered by Callis, a full-service advertising agency with a focus on marketing rural America. Callis offers a wide range of integrated marketing services, including website development, search engine marketing, social media, video, and digital. We develop strategic and creative campaigns to build your brand and your business, and you can learn more about us at ecallis.com. Now join me in the front seat as we head out on the road to success. Let's go. Hey folks, welcome to Outdrive. We've got another great story to share with you today about life and work in rural America. This week, we're back with Paul Ruppert, a strategy consultant who specializes in mobile telecommunications, working with private equity firms and enterprise-level companies. Paul has such a great story with so much to say, we couldn't fit it all into one episode. So I asked him to come back for another conversation, and he graciously accepted. Last week, as you may recall, we discussed some of the interesting projects and organizations Paul's had the opportunity to work with all over the world. So this week, he's back to share his insight on the 10 most important points to consider when taking a rural America company into the global markets. It's pretty fascinating. I think you're going to enjoy it. Welcome back to Outdrive, Paul.
Hello, Cliff. Great to be here again. Thanks very much for the opportunity to have a second shot or a second bite at the apple.
Well, I really enjoyed our conversation. I think our audience did as well. You had so many great stories to tell and a lot of insight on a lot of different topics. And, you have such a great story in and of itself, of yourself, just from your experience and expertise and, helping companies grow and to scale. And, as I thought back about our conversations, there were some key topics I think that we really never had a chance to get into that I want to get into today. And I think the biggest one, and you and I have been talking about this with your experience, is, if you're a small, medium, even large company that's operating in rural America, but you have products that are of interest around the world, it could be pretty overwhelming and intimidating to think about the idea of taking your product globally. And so with your expertise, let's focus today on those things that a rural American company ought to think about if they're thinking about taking their products globally. So with that, give us the Paul Ruppert elevator speech again so people remember who you are.
Sure. Well, thanks
let's
very
start
much
talking about going global.
for that, Cliff. Certainly be happy to talk about that. I've been in the mobile telecommunications business for about 25 years. Specifically, 95% of that has been looking at global markets and global expansion, either in terms of the types of services that we all utilize, like international roaming. So your phone works when you get off a plane, let's say in London or in Hong Kong. Or conversely, you've got people coming into Missouri or St. Louis and your phone works immediately, including all the billing and back end aspects. I had a job where I was responsible for negotiating those B2B agreements with all the other mobile network operators around the world when I was at AT&T. I then moved into new technology at the time, which was text messaging. And within the context of a rank cockroach startup, and 5 years later, we sold it for a little under $500 million. And that was in the messaging space. And that was enabling text messages to flow through interoperability technology from the likes of GSM radio handsets, as it was called, let's say T-Mobile US, as it is today, to non-GSM radio handsets, which would be going to, let's say, Verizon back then. So that's kind of how I've been working in the space. And then in the last few years, I've been consulting back to enterprises, helping them leverage text messaging more effectively in communicating with their customers and the marketplace overall. My clients have included MasterCard, private equity firms like the Carlyle Group, as well as enterprises such as LiveVox, LivePerson, which is the customer care realm. So I'm able to kind of blend my skills and apply them to a number of different arenas and strategies. Now, to your point, the question is, can lessons be applied from, let's say, the high tech realm of mobile technology to rural economies, that are driven primarily through, as we were talking about earlier, food and fiber, as well as light manufacturing? And in my view, the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, I'd probably say there are 10 points to consider if you were looking at being able to expand into international markets. The first thing is obviously looking at yourself and the type of product that you have and leverage your local advantage. Now, what I mean by that is, are there unique qualities of your products that create a compelling story that resonates not only domestically in the US market or the North American market, but also in other markets around the world? As we alluded to in our first conversation, for example, about 20 to 30% of Chinese pork consumption is driven by American pork, and that's their primary source of protein. Now, if we had looked at that number 30 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, that was clearly not the case. And we've been able to develop that market because of the quality of American goods, the security of American goods, such as pork, and that type of food opportunity. So it's a matter of how it translates. I often worked in a matrix in my own expansion of how do we want to be able to go domestically, attack that market, but then more importantly, look over the horizon across the ponds, if you will, and figure out how you can take your product as it is today and position it in international markets. And in many cases, you really don't have to do anything. For example, I was reading about a toy company that didn't even have in directions for the assembly of their toys in any language. It was all done graphically. So they knew that they were looking to go global from the start, which was another aspect of how do you want to start off? Do you want to just go from 0 to 1 in the context of an opportunity and being able to develop a market and provide a solution to it? Or do you want to really go big and go global? Now, in telecommunications, especially in what I was doing, the network effects allowed us to consider we're not going to just connect the likes of Verizon and T-Mobile in the US. We want to be able to connect the entire world to be able to connect into North America much more effectively. So think in those terms, in terms of how can you leverage your local advantage and then take it globally. The second aspect to this, and I think it would probably be very critical in terms of these considerations, is build strategic partnerships. So look to form alliances with international distributors who might share your vision, or you create a vision for them and can navigate through those local markets as a result of that partnership. I often talk in terms of communication skills, the notion of being able to create fantasy and new beliefs, if you will. That's what make believe is. It's not really Disney, it's you're fostering a different vision, a different belief from what it was before to the idea that you have today. And to be able to do that, you need partners, especially most effectively. And how that works, it could be anything from you being able to go to, your local chamber of commerce or your local state economic development initiatives, because there are a number of different, either in over here, regional as well as national entities that help foster that. And there's a commerce department, if you will, in the agricultural department that you can tap into and leverage that connection that they've already established. And what's really effective is you're able to go on various types of trade trips as something else that you would want to consider, so that you can actually sit down with potential buyers, and the commerce department will help enable that. Now,
So
obviously,
that
I'm in the tech. Sure.
so that a question pops into my mind as
Yeah.
you say that. When you said, well, there's opportunities all over the world. How do you determine where you're going to go with your product? What kind
Well,
of things? Well, maybe I'm jumping ahead, and I apologize
no,
if I
that's okay.
am. But how do you determine that I'm going to go to China versus Italy or Japan versus what I'm saying? What
Sure. That's
drives?
essentially the same thing that I had to do once upon a time when I had a blank page in front of me. Okay, Paul, what do we do to go global? Tell us what we need to do.
Exactly.
And yeah, so Then it becomes do your homework and do the research in terms of where do you think your biggest market opportunities are. I had never been to China, for example, even though I happened to have French and traveled through Europe as a kid, but I'd never really turned to Asia. And once I got into this startup and looked at the various types of traffic that already existed in voice traffic, I looked at that as okay, my paths have already been established. I can just imitate voice traffic because that's really what's going to happen in utilizing and driving messaging traffic. So if you have, let's say, an adjacent comparable to your product or to your service that you can look at and go, well, this isn't exactly the same, but we kind of utilize the same type of services, or we provide the same type of value proposition, or very similar, let's say 6 out of 10 counts, maybe that's what you should be looking at as a market opportunity. And again, I started, where did I go first in my context? The largest amount of telephony information and telephony activity flows between, I'll give you a guess. Where do you think? The US and what other country? Give it a shot.
I was going to say London, Europe, UK.
Correct. The UK, exactly. Our close cousins, if you will. So I started realizing that would be the best opportunity to start doing business development initiatives and back to partnerships because of my experience as a roaming director. I knew that I could go to people that I already knew in London and in the UK and in Europe that I had prior business relationships with and say, I've got this solution. It's really kind of cool. And many of them looked at me skeptically as to how do you do that? We don't know how you can do that. We don't know this technology. Well, back to creating a new belief, creating make believe and turning it into reality. I was able to pitch to them, here's what's going on, and I'm looking for partners, and they opened doors up for me. Now, at the same time, I also realized where are the largest population centers of offshore speakers of other languages? Now, here's another little trick for you. What do you think is the second or the third most often spoken home language in the United States is?
I'm guessing Asian, Chinese.
Close. Not Chinese, but Filipino, Tagalog, as it's called.
Interesting.
So this little piece of information presented itself to me. Now, ironically, I also had been looking at the Philippines, which was one of the leading adopters of text messaging around the world, including the Scandinavian countries. So as I said, where do you want to go? I started seeing the adoption and the usage and the discussion of this new technology being applied in Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Norway and Finland, and then realizing, okay, where else is it going on? And in the Philippines, it was very, very high usage. So I started looking at demographic distribution of Filipino speakers in the United States. Houston is a huge center of that, and Las Vegas is another huge center for all the obvious reasons. Started learning more about the economy in the Philippines with all the foreign workers. Well, guess what drives telephony usage? You're not at home, you're in Saudi Arabia or you're in Las Vegas and you're working for your family, you're sending money back and you go back maybe once a year, twice a year, whatever it might be. That's how their economy works. So, my third trip literally globally was I was on a plane to Manila and started knocking on doors. And that became just as a little story. We had set up a test account for one of the major operators in the Philippines where we were testing traffic. We were sending text messages between our connection, which was T-Mobile US, and the Filipino connections, Smart and Globe, et cetera. And one of my test engineers we were talking about how it was going to work. We were expecting probably about a couple thousand test messages that we're going to send through. Not that difficult an exercise. Well, he got a little bit busy in the day, and then the next day he came to my office sheepishly saying, "Hey, Paul, I forgot to shut down the traffic last night." Now, his concern was that that was a live circuit that we had with Verizon, which we were spending money for. So he thought that, what's this going to cost, et cetera. I'm like, what's the volume that you've said? Well, I didn't even check, but let me check. He came back and was like, you're not going to believe this. We got 25,000 messages that were sent last night. I'm like, okay, well, I know the Filipinos aren't marketing this. And I know we're not even talking about it outside of our partner with Verizon as to being able to set this up. What that was an indication of a spontaneous traffic. There were people in the Philippines who were trying to see if they could send a text message. So this was something that was commonplace in the Philippines in terms of sending text messages, see if they worked, to their friends in Las Vegas or Seattle, or wherever, the Houston, wherever it might be in the United States. And we knew immediately, wow, we just got a tiger by our tail. And that became a major component. And, I reached out to my Filipino partner saying, you're not going to believe we've already seen the traffic. So we want to be able to get this done quickly. And ironically, back to leveraging commercial opportunities and market expansion, I immediately called the two other competitors of theirs and say, we've got this solution. This is what's going on. Do you want to sign up for it? Now, we gave an advantage to Smart, which was the first one. We gave them a 6-month non-compete, but we had the other guys ready to go to buy our service. And that's how we enabled and took advantage of it. Sometimes you get lucky,
I was going to say, is that called accidental research?
Yeah, well, it was just a matter of, okay, this is where we need to go, set it up, do all the due diligence, engage the campaign, excuse me, the campaign, and then all of a sudden, wow, this is amazing. So,
That's awesome.
and the third point that I was about to raise in all this, which is consistent with the story, which is, embrace technology. So in this case, we were talking about how mobile platforms and digital platforms connect directly with your international consumers and essentially bypass a traditional barrier, which was they were expecting that they wouldn't be able to do it. They didn't know if they'd be able to send messages to their friends and families via Verizon or the non-GSM radio formats like in Sprint or Nextel back then. This was in the early 2000s, and it just took off. And so in this case, they embraced technology very quickly. And even this leads to my next point, which is understand the cultural nuances, which I call the cultural codes.
That's
So,
probably a tough one, isn't it?
well, it is if you're narrow in your focus, just thinking if we do it here in the US, it's going to be done the same way in the UK or done the same way in Japan or done in China the same way, when in fact, it's not. There are different behavioral elements, back to the Filipinos. At the time, they were driving messaging, and this is very early on in the evolution of messaging. They were driving about 100 messages per user per day, and it was a very, very cheap service. And especially in the developing economy, which was the Philippines, you have such a wide disparity in terms of wealth and economic power that they even had a thing where you could buy a sachet, which is like a small soap
Hmm.
dispenser, but instead of buying like a whole month's worth of time, you're only buying a few minutes, and they called that a sachet in the Philippines. So
Interesting.
people would be buying that, yes, and they wouldn't be going to their standalone store, if you will. They were buying it through what was called sachet ladies. So there were people out in the economy who were selling this to their friends, to their families inside offices, and they were essentially a distributor for the large mobile network operators. It was very, very sharp business acumen in being able to get this distributed and tapped into the right level. And again, understanding cultural nuances of text messaging used by the Filipinos versus somebody in the UK. I think we talked about it in the last session, where in the UK there was a loss of, or there was a lowering of purchasing of candy and cigarettes for an initial period when messaging and and mobile telephony took off in the UK, and that was because there was a diversion of expense from those by primarily high school and middle school students to mobile airtime and mobile minutes time. So all these are the different nuances that you experience.
And I would guess that your partners could help you through some of this based on their experience and expertise and understanding of what those cultures are and the differences between those cultures and how that translates into a specific product.
They should. Most importantly, I'm gonna share a personal bias. As I said, I happen to be half French. And one of the things, even though my mother spent almost 35 years here in the United States, and she was a World War II bride, she always took a moment to point out to me Americans in Europe, and it was pretty easy to tell. primarily because they weren't really adapting to the cultural nuances very effectively in Europe at that time. Okay. It's kind of like today, if you go off and, if you're a tourist in some other parts of the world, there are many people who are still wearing those called their mom and dad jeans and New Balance shoes, and they really stand out as not locals. And that and now can be an issue of security, who knows? So the point there is that walk in with a very open-minded perspective in terms of how you can operate in that marketplace. And candidly, you may not be able to operate in the marketplace. So you're able to make that decision up front instead of having it a costly exercise, an experiment, a science project down the road. But instead, either partner well with someone else who can open that door with you. As I said, I had the benefit of having prior relationships, business relationships in these various regions around the world because of the nature of the work that I did. And I'm certain that given the types of the dynamics and the opportunities that are in rural America, as you mentioned, like manufacturing, food, fiber, et cetera, I am sure given the globalization and the globalized nature of these markets, you can find partners who can be your scout, if you will, your guide through the navigating through the jungles of these different types of markets. And that goes back to, as I mentioned earlier, the usual path is domestic market sales, international market sales, which is just really no different than what you're doing domestically. You're just pushing it across a border. Sometimes you might start to localize it so that you have different shrink wrap, different types of directions, so that it is attuned to those cultural differences and those market differences. But then if you're lucky and you're able to grow large enough that your domestic market, your home market that you started your business off in, is now becomes secondary because your global market is so much bigger. And that's when you are truly a global company, not when you're pushing across borders, but when things shift in terms of the distribution and the market power, the market generators of your revenue portfolio.
Do you typically find that cross-border marketing, cross-border success is a transitional step to the global market, or do most people just jump right into global?
Well, here then is another difference between us and those offshore. So the US marketplace is the largest consumer economy in the world. Everybody wants to sell into the US market, and we want to be able to trade with those offshore. So if you, however, are starting a business, could be agricultural, could be technology, in the UK, for example, well, you have a much smaller market to deal with in terms of domestic market. In fact, there are only about 60 million people, as I recall, in the UK. We're 5 times larger. I think the UK would fit into about the size of the East Coast, between maybe North Carolina and Maine or something along those lines. We're talking about a smaller footprint, which means you're starting off with a limited upside. Your floor may be higher, but your ceiling is very low. So what do you want to do? You want to be able to cross border almost from the start. And that's why so many UK-based companies, for example, if you look at the history of their economy, that's why they started to leverage international trade from the beginning, whether it was with France or with the Nordic countries or the Scandinavian countries, et cetera. So the same idea in the States, if you're starting something off, it may be adequate for you to just market in the US, but if you have higher aspirations, you want to be able to look at what are the international opportunities. And the last point that I want to really emphasize here is that that can be accretive at some point in your development, because you may be doing something your competitors are not. Again, drawing from my own experience, that was something we saw immediately. We had competitors in the marketplace, but because of very smart board members who knew me, asked me to come in and start looking at this opportunity. And it wasn't just me, but it was a matter of, hey, we can globalize this very, very quickly. And depending on whether we want to do an IPO or we want to sell off in the eventualities down the road, that international revenue stream could be accretive to our overall value proposition. And that's exactly how it played out in the end. In fact, by the time we sold the company, quote, I owned as the international sales lead about 62% of the overall revenues of the company. which I knew going in, not to be bragging, but I knew that the market offshore would be much stronger than the domestic market in and of itself. We just understood the dynamics of telephony, that that was going to be the case. The rest of the world is bigger than the US market.
And you knew that because of your experience and expertise. How does somebody who doesn't have that depth of knowledge try to project what the potential is?
Well, I think that goes back to, the kind of the talking that we talked about earlier in terms of be bold, that fortune favors the audacious. Don't limit your horizons, is what I would be saying. If you feel that there's too much risk in offering an opportunity cross border, look again at how do you mitigate that risk. So we talked about, that was number 2 on my list in terms of building strategic partnerships, and that will mitigate your risk. Find the right partner, the right distributor, whatever that channel might be, and leverage it to the best you can. And then look for other opportunities that are going to be support that initiative, that going global from the start. And that may be, different types of technologies or different, even potential competitors, because you're technically not competing with them when you start to reach out to them. I'm not one to think that, just because somebody's wearing a different, jersey, if you will, but they're doing the same thing. We're both trying to advance the market. We're trying to expand the pie. It's not binary, especially in something like I was involved in, which was all new technologies, innovation, being applied. We knew that if we expanded the market and expanded the pie, we'd all benefit. So I was never one of those, oh, well, you work for the competitors, I'm not going to talk about you and I'm not going to talk to you. It was more along the lines of how can we work together or in parallel to be able to expand the market together. And the last piece, especially in telephony, especially in the space that I was in, networking was key, not just the physical, emotional, personal networking, but the technical networking was how all this was accomplished. And that's how the telecommunications services and world works. It's the most interconnected technology you can imagine. It's also the largest because it spreads across the world. And we don't do this in an island. We don't do this by ourselves. We do it by partnering. And sometimes your adversaries are also your allies and vice versa. For example, in my space, in the messaging space, I had connections into mobile network operators that were American that others didn't have. So they had to come through me. But they had the same advantage over me in terms of getting connectivity, for example, into China or into other parts of Europe or Latin America. So we had to do a trade-off between the two of us. And that's how I say we became allies, but we were also adversaries in the marketplace. And that's how the business works.
So, from a marketing perspective, what kind of changes would a U.S. manufacturer expect to see in the way that goods and services are marketed globally or even overseas or even cross marketing? I mean, cross border.
Sure. Well, I don't look at the world as though it's the 1960s or 1970s any longer. We're in the
Probably good.
21st. Yeah, we're in the 21st century. We're even talking about post-globalization effects, that the world is shrinking, which may be the case in terms of trade, et cetera. But in reality, these things always transpire. They always go on in terms of contraction and expansion. So in my view, yes, because of a whole bunch of different factors that are at play, we are moving around to a different form of international trade, which then becomes another opportunity of being able to expand beyond that. And again, back to how do you break into that opportunity? We've been covering this relative to cultural nuances, partnerships, what's your local advantage, what's your unique selling proposition, if you will, and being able to move into those different spaces. And that's how you become cognizant aware that what you're putting together has to have traction in that marketplace. Again, from my own experience, very early on, I went to a conference in China, telecommunications conference. I do not speak Chinese, but I got somebody who did. And we took one of our white papers that was written in English, and it had it fully translated into Chinese characters. And then when we were at the event, which had about 500 people, and in fact, I was one of the speakers because this was a new type of innovation that we were trying to promulgate. I had this translator was speaking. We were going back and forth, English, Chinese, English, Chinese. And at the same time, we were distributing this white paper all in Chinese. And that was in 2002, 2003, long time ago. But that's the expectation as it is today, that when you walk into that marketplace, not everything is going to be printed in, again, international language that English is. It's still not it's not still so predominant that you might have technologists looking at it who may not be as strong in English skills, or commercial guys who are trying to figure out, hey, how does this really work? And instead, it's all right there.
What else should a company that's operating out here in rural America consider about trying to do business globally? What are some other things they ought to be thinking about?
Probably the thing that we hadn't talked about so far is optimizing your supply chain and having an understanding, again, back to food and fiber. That's, you've got a pretty good handle in terms of supply chain and security and maintaining the quality of the product. So that's something that,
But now you've got to maintain the quality of the product as it goes across the world.
correct, correct. And that's where I was leading to. Same idea in terms of what is the entire logistical supply chain that you want to be able to utilize and innovate, if you will, to be able to make sure that your product is being consumed the right way, is being secured, as well as you're getting the right type of finances, because that's something we haven't talked about, which is the back end operation, having an understanding of the compliance and staying ahead of international trade regulations, which we talked a little bit about, but more importantly, how do you commercially operate in this new region? Back again to my own experience, we had to set up a separate entity in Brazil because of the nature of you cannot expatriate profits at the time. I can't remember the terminology, but in the same respect, we set up which I led, the entity, what's called a wholly owned foreign entity, or a WOFE, which was how we were able to operate in China, again, utilizing partners, not being subservient to the partners, but being able to maintain control both of the financial and the compliance and the regulatory aspects of what we had to do to be able to ensure the security of our service. So it wasn't, quote, stolen, but in the same respect that we were complying with US law and Chinese law.
So does that usually require a financial partner in the country in which you're doing business, or are most domestic financial institutions prepared to support a company as it grows globally?
Most financial institutions in the US have that capability, whether it's Bank of America, for example, or Wells Fargo, or even local regional banks have that capability today. Now, if you want, you can utilize a local banker. We also had to utilize local lawyers. So we went out and, ironically, again, I went to people that I knew in the UK, asking them, do you have representation in Hong Kong who can provide us with this type of guidance? And they were like, yes. And then the other aspect is, what currencies are you going to be able to trade in? Now, everyone thinks that everybody's going to utilize the dollar. But in reality, there may be some buyers of your service that don't want to have that kind of currency exposure, which can be considerable depending on how big your revenues are. So we decided, all right, our currency of records are going to be the UK pound, the euro, the US dollar, and the Singaporean dollar. So that took some, we had sophisticated enough financial guys who were controller and CFO were saying, yeah, we can manage this, but we can't do everything. So we've got to make prioritization of what currencies we want to trade in. So those are all part and parcel. That will come in time. It's not something you need to worry about on day one, unless you're really making a big investment on going big really fast.
So just to flip the script on you a bit, if I'm overseas and I'm thinking about selling my goods and services into rural America, does anything change, or are all these principles and philosophies pretty much the same?
I would say that they are pretty much the same. I think the difference would be in the approach. Instead of being reactive to the conditions that you are now going to be entering, because that's kind of what you're doing. You're looking at a new region and figuring out what do we need to adapt to be able to operate in, flip the switch, and then be more proactive as to, I wonder if anybody would like to trade with us. So that goes back to maybe even potential competitors who are over in Europe that you might be aware of, thinking that you're going to go into those regions. You may have a presence, you may not have a presence, but then back to, leveraging that the telecommunications, seeing networking effects. There too, we did the same thing. We were operating in a new region, granted, but we were smaller than other players. Who did we want to align that might be a bigger player that we were offering up? We've got a value proposition that you can trade with us. That's essentially what trade is all about, isn't it? It's you're taking something that is A, that could be fungible to B, which could be cash, or vice versa. Even to the point of, what did we buy Manhattan Island for? A bunch of beads, a few other things. And, they gave up one thing for another thing, not to be dismissive of that, but that's really what trade is all about, isn't it? Whether it's food and fiber or whether it's fighters, one thing or the other.
That's a very simplified look at that. And I think that's a great way to look at it because really anything's possible through research, through commerce, through communications. It is kind of
Absolutely.
amazing.
Yeah, there's just this is a little off the track of the conversation, but there is a great book called A Splendid Exchange, which is the history of global trade. I think it was written in 1995. It was an economist book of the year. I might be off. I can't remember the name of the author. I read it back then, and it just talks about the origins of trade going back to like 4000 BC. They're able to figure this stuff out. And
Wow.
they even describing, because there are all these texts that were found along the way. So they have primary historical records that are describing what was going on, in 100 BC, and it goes through all the old ancient aspects of civilization and how that was done. It's a great read. Great read.
And it's a simple exchange,
Yeah, a splendid exchange.
a splendid exchange.
Yeah, I'll send you the actual citation after the call. You can put that in the show notes.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, I think one last thing that I'd like to incorporate into our discussion today, since you've always been sort of leading edge in adopting the use of technologies and being an innovator in the different spaces you've been working in, how does AI play into all this?
The girl with the curl at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Meaning everybody's interested in AI. Um,
And they
yeah,
should be,
just
right?
yes, just put on AI to everything that you're doing, and there we have it. You're now an AI company. You know, as a result of this transformative technology, it can be applied in so many different ways, whether it's networking the technology of mobile telecommunications to include, the repeating aspects, the antenna aspects. There's so many different aspects of how it can be applied at the material level, but it can also be applied in the commercial level. So we talked about some of my experience in working with call centers and customer care as a service providers. That's probably the most direct interface that we will experience, where you are engaging with essentially an autonomous entity, which is the chatbot. And the chatbot is driven by artificial intelligence being distilled from machine learning. This is how all of this integrates and incorporates into being able to solve everything from your billing problem to why isn't your phone working even though you just got off the plane in London, if you will. So it will be quite pervasive. And we talked a little bit about conversational commerce in our first conversation. That's essentially driving more efficient use of telecommunications and mobile telephony, your handset being able to make decisions on your behalf in terms of your own direction, not necessarily like search, but you and I might be talking about where we might want to have lunch sometime maybe next week. And it's recognizing that I'm in Washington, D.C. and you're in Missouri. And then it picks up that I'm going to be traveling to Missouri based on my travel agenda, and it will present to me, would you like to eat at maybe your local restaurant in Missouri? that's kind of way over the horizon type stuff. But
It's kind of provocative to think about, though, isn't it?
yeah. And if you really want to go deep, we can also start talking about quantum computing, which is even way out there. So just think about it's no longer binary. It's now multiple stages of being off and on. But that's an entirely different conversation.
That might have to be the third episode down the road.
There we go.
I know I've taken you maybe a little off track with where you started, but just to kind of try to sum it up a little bit, is there anything else that you want to add to this discussion about points that a company should consider in doing commerce globally?
Yeah, the last point that I would raise is educate your market. As I mentioned earlier on, creating that new belief. So that new belief is essentially educating the marketplace to help inform the market and the market terrain of new opportunities and unique benefits of your own products and the uses of your products, whatever they might be. And that's recreating or creating a new belief, creating that fantasy, if you will, as to, I wonder if we could do this, like go to the moon, and then realize, yeah, we can go to the moon. Let's go sell this.
Great insight. Hey, Paul, thanks again for being with us today. That's been a really interesting conversation and one that I was really looking forward to continuing. So I want to thank you again for being with us twice and for sharing all of your expertise and experience with us. It's been a joy.
It's been a great pleasure on my part as well, Cliff, and I hope your audience found it interesting and compelling to listen through all the way.
I'm sure they did. Folks, thanks for listening to Outdrive. I hope you've enjoyed this second visit with Paul Ruppert, strategy consultant. Come back again next week, and I'll take you down the roads of rural America, where it's heaven on earth.
Thanks for taking a ride with us on Outdrive. This episode is complete, so head on over to ecallis.com for more insight you can apply to help drive your business growth. And be sure to sign up for our free monthly e-letter, Outthink, for even more helpful content about marketing to rural America. Have a great day and keep on driving.